So what we are dealing with here is a sort of starting point for a more broader concept, a more broader mode of critical analysis and critical mapping, really. So what we have here is just my attempt at a sort of starting point, to try and empty the mind, to try and empty the just the multitude of research and critical points in this vastly rich environment of cultural criticism and aesthetic criticism. So what we have here is just a starting point, an idea really of how we might just, like I said, just empty those concepts and those thoughts and try to map them out in a way that is understandable, to sort of get an overview. But this is a really crude form. However, it is good because we can sort of, well, as you will see in the broader work that I've produced here, you will see that I can use this and then use these digital tools that we have, particularly in my case with Evernote. We can use this, scan it as a document using smart devices, and then build on it and sort of use this idea of a sort of a left space and a right space, an input space and an output space, to sort of get a grounding and anchoring perspective on it. We can use this, this format and build different kinds of maps and different kinds of frameworks around that. So as you will see in the broader work, the Prezi structure that I've got, you will see that I have got just a little bit more of a critical explanation in there. I've also produced a Byung-Chul Han diagnostics piece. So with Byung-Chul Han, his work is very aphoristic. It's very much a sort of assemblage of a wide range of ideas, presented in a sort of like a curated style, really. Very much tapping into this dominant logic that we have going on right now, this logic of curation, of collecting, and just this kind of musealization logic that's dominating right now. But so sort of collecting and putting things into categories and just sort of building those databases. So his work really just lend itself really well to this kind of piece. So you'll see that on there. So what we have on the left here is that sort of ideological space, that sort of pre-subjective space, for a sort of understanding of what I mean with that. We can think of Stephen Shaviro's idea of pre-subjective affect. So that kind of pre-subjective sort of sort of the flows of the flows of our media environment are situated around here, and it's a sort of space that is kind of like a precursor to what comes around here. So simply put, this is kind of this is kind of the pathological space. Well, not the pathological, the pathogenic space, and this is the pathological space. So recognizing our environment as an environment which engenders sickness engenders sickness in the subject, or in broader subjectivity overall, because We're not talking about a center. We're not talking about a central subject. We're talking about a kind of free-floating ambient sensibility, which is very much categorized and by sickness and by all kinds of strange outputs that we see in aesthetics, particularly when you start looking at the popular productions that have been made, even on Netflix. You know, you can go on to Black Mirror and you can see a lot of these things here, this idea of transferable consciousnesses. So if I'm tapping into Byung-Chul Han's idea of the achievement subject and this whole environment as an environment of achievement society, you can see that where I might be able to pinpoint this idea of transferable consciousness and where it comes from, the environment that is the matrix of this particular concept, this particular mode of operation. So if I was using transferable consciousnesses and linking that to this idea of the achievement society and the achievement subject, I might say that even though this is a bizarre concept, because we are basically talking about immortality, or particularly certainly the idea of immortality is a natural corollary of this. If you look at Altered Carbon, even when the character dies, you know, his consciousness is transported into another vessel, which is used as a he's basically got a project. There's like a utilitarian function to this idea of transferable consciousness, because and this very much goes towards this idea of burnout and exhaustion from subjects just constantly trying to produce and achieve and just to do something. So we very much see this, and it's as if this space of capital, this space of achievement subject and self as project, it does not seem to entertain the idea of an end, entertain the idea of death. You know, there's no respite, there's no escape from this space of capital, this space of constant self exploitation. I think Byung-Chul Han calls it auto exploitation. So the self as both exploited and exploiter. So yeah, this idea of transferable consciousness is really something that I've noticed is popping up a lot right now, and it certainly represents this idea, and you see it in Black Mirror. For example, there's an episode where the female, one of the main female characters, she dies, and then her consciousness is copied onto a digital file. This comes up in a lot of episodes of Black Mirror, but the one I'm thinking of right now is so her digital consciousness is copied onto a file and then used and put into a teddy bear, so that her child can still have access to her, and she can still watch her child growing up. But she really is just a digital copy, but she's sentient and she feels everything. And it's very barbaric and a very scary idea, and it's not completely outside of the realms of possibility, especially as a sort of concept when we're thinking about just how much capital and technological progression tries to get out of you. It's this weird sort of oppressive space where it's very much driven by this directive of just constant progression, constant evolution. This idea of the idea of the transhuman, which is basically just a self that is very much working towards the benefits of the capitalist structure that's going on here. So if we look at McLuhan, certainly a lot more relevant today than he was when he was at his peak. I like this idea of McLuhan introducing us to a sort of cybernetic dynamic. So the McLuhan's ground and his figure, so the figure being the medium, and the ground being everything that supports the medium. So basically, kind of a contextual space, an ideological space, certainly. These two things run in a sort of cybernetic circular relationship. So the ground will inform the figure, which then feeds back into the ground, and then the message is somewhere in the middle. Of course, we know he said the medium is the message, and that's certainly the case, because the medium certainly informs and inflects how society and the kind of broader sensibility of society and how the logic of society overall. So the medium will certainly have an impact on that. So this again, we're getting into a bit of Deleuzian ideas here. So the royal science and deterritorialization, because capital is very much a deterritorializing realm. And then, of course, when it passes through this middle, which I will go on to in a little second, so as it passes through this, I like to think of it as not, the brain is just an analogy, but I like to think of it as a sort of perceptual organ. But as it passes through this part, and then we see these are the things that we see in aesthetics and in the modern subject overall, but as it passes through there, it certainly gets re-territorialized by capital. Which, of course, that's how capital sort of embeds its logic into the subject. So as you can see on here, certainly a lot of tropes and themes that we see in aesthetics, amnesia or the cultural amnesiac, nomad subjects. It's just a sort of free-floating subjectivity that very much goes on around here. It can be represented by certainly the camera or the perspective of a subject, or but yeah. So I like to see this. I like to open up the possibility of seeing this all as a sort of closed system, using operating through a prism of cybernetics. This certainly helps us get a even more grounded and solid perspective, and particularly when there's just such a spate of critical frameworks being produced to help us grasp what on earth is going on in our contemporary moment. This seeing it as cybernetics, it really, and it's not definitive, and that's the thing. I think one of the main things we have to do is to try and get a more kind of humble epistemology. I think that's what we need to do. We need to get a more humble idea of knowledge and understand that we can't get that central Cartesian sort of overview. Especially you'll see that in modern day aesthetics. There's no Cartesian subject. There's no sort of bird's eye view of what's going on from an omniscient kind of narrator or subjectivity or camera or something like that. So we need to get a more humble position and sort of try to formulate a more humble epistemology. So if we see it as cybernetics, this can help, because if we see it as cybernetics, we see how the whole system just functions and how inputs and outputs, and we can see this side as the steering side, the side where the side that takes the output, and then we'll steer that to perpetuate the system and to also enhance the system and augment it, which then of course leads to even more alienated subjects and a more alienated subjectivity that plagues this sort of networked late capital society that we're kind of going through right now, this digital neoliberalism, I like to think of it as. But what cybernetics can do is it allows us to sort of find a locus of power. Of course, it's difficult, and if you read any Jameson or anything like that, you will see that this is an unrepresentable space. It's a space that we can't. It's certainly a struggle to get a grasp on it. But if we can use this cybernetic paradigm, we can see who are the not who, but what is steering the ship and what is modulating the ship. I like this idea of modulation from Shaviro. But we can see what is steering the ship, and it certainly helps us try to then get a more hopeful or produce a more hopeful politics where we can kind of challenge this this battleground of ideas, and we know exactly where to focus. It's not so much cutting the head off the snake. That's not a novelty that we have right now, because power is very much dispersed. There's no real locus of power, so we can't really find the snake to chop the head off. But we certainly know, we can certainly look at the ideological underpinnings which are driving our technological environment right now, and which, if you look at here, the algorithms and sort of the tech itself and the biases, this idea of technological biases and coded biases within these technologies from Rushkoff, we can start to look at that and understand that this is not a kind of deterministic thing. It's more it's all been coded, so it's not necessarily here by naturally. It's been coded in a certain way. There are certain biases embedded in these technologies, which is another potential root of the pathologies that we see around this side. This idea of particularly a crisis of temporality. That's certainly one. If we see this space as a sort of the space of flows and timeless time from Castells, we can see how it's hard to try and formulate or to come to grips with a sort of action that we might enact to counter this kind of oppressive and complex space right here, this pre-subjective space, because time is certainly one of the most notable things that has undergone a kind of rupture in this era. So the reason for the brain image, I like to think of this as an analogy for a kind of, because we're not talking about, like I said, we're not talking about Cartesian subjectivity. We're not a sole objective wanderer in this space that is removed from it and looking around. We are very much plugged into these virtual flows, these disorientating flows. But I like to see this as a kind of perceptual organ that these flows here have to transfer through, which then leads to these certainly bewildering and sort of skewed emotions and effects and subjective outputs. But this is certainly the filter. This is the filtering area, and this is how that filter. This is how it manifests itself once it goes through this middle point here. As you can see there, we've got a lot of speed, and now, as you will see in some of my later works that I will be producing very soon, I'm very much focused on this idea of just perceptual overload and a sort of impoverishment of perspective, because we have a lack of pause, We've got no capacity for gaps whatsoever. Boredom here, if you can see, I've got boredom and thought. There's no, in this space of digital capital and late capital, which is very much wedded to our technological infrastructure and our technological environment. It does not allow for any sense of reflection, particularly if you are in complete thrall of capital. Capital is infected everywhere in this current moment. It's infected our phones, it's infected our aesthetics. Certainly some aesthetics, we can uncover some gaps, and I will move into that at a later time because there's a lot on that, but we can certainly find some gaps, even if it's minuscule, just a modicum of hope. And I think that's the sort of crux of where I'm going. I kind of operate from a meta-modern sensibility. I recognize that we are in a space where we have undergone so much irony through postmodernism. And I really want to go, I really like this idea that we're moving towards a post-irony, a new sincerity, a meta-modern subjectivity and structure of feeling, where we recognize that the time for irony is over. We really need to start finding that hope again, even if we don't, even if it's a sort of informed naivety, which is very much a concept that promulgates from the meta-modern milieu. But this is the crucial thing here. So trying to find these gaps as these frantic and rapid flows just wash over us. It's about finding these gaps, these moments of pause, these moments of reflection, even boredom. You know, when we can't be bored anymore because we're so overstimulated, and we're always at the thrall of capital and labor, and labor power has been abused so egregiously in this era. So it's just constant production, constant cognitive productions, particularly effective labor. It's just a constant state of laboring, and there's no room for pause, because even in the moments of leisure, we're in thrall of the society of the spectacle. I very much believe that is still relevant today. There's a lot of distraction because capital is great at producing things, but unfortunately these things do not afford a sort of reflective and critical mindset. So the crucial project of today is to map out what is going on right now, to certainly encourage a community of mappers, as I like to think of them, open up the source material for collaboration so that we can all come to grips with where exactly we are right now, but in a humble manner, so that we're not kind of stridently proclaiming that we know what is going on right now as a totality, but we can sort of get a good grasp of it, to then find these gaps, these moments of reflection, these moments of thought, these moments where we find crevices in the system. There's tiny little gaps, because they are still left. There's not much right now. Capital has certainly flattened the space. It's certainly saturated all moments where we might find those little gaps, those crevices, those moments of hope and pause and reflection, those moments where we might challenge and come to reconnect with our center, our humanity. But there's certainly hope, and there's certainly this is certainly a call for action. I very much believe in mapping. I think mapping has to be the predominant mode of our moment right now. I think mapping is the only way we can get an overview of the situation, know exactly where we are right now.